Between 1887 and 1923, the Coldwater Children's Reformatory in Detroit claimed to rehabilitate over 3,000 troubled youth, yet city records show only 1,147 ever returned home. The limestone walls of the Coldwater Children's Reformatory stood like silent sentinels along the Detroit River, their Gothic architecture casting long shadows across the muddy banks where children once played. Built with the noblest intentions and funded by Detroit's industrial elite, the institution promised to transform wayward youth into productive citizens. But beneath the veneer of Christian charity and progressive reform lay a machinery of systematic cruelty that would claim hundreds of young lives. The dark waters of the Detroit River carried away more than just industrial waste. They carried the screams of children whose names would be erased from official records, whose families would be told they had simply run away or died of natural causes. What began as a beacon of hope for Detroit's most vulnerable children became a feeding ground for predators who understood that society's discarded youth could disappear without anyone asking questions. The institution's reputation. The Coldwater Children's Reformatory rose from the banks of the Detroit River in 1887, a testament to the progressive spirit that swept through American cities in the late 19th century. Funded by a consortium of Detroit's most prominent industrialists, including automotive pioneer Henry Ford's early business partner, William Harris, the institution represented everything the growing city aspired to. Become modern, compassionate, and morally upright. The reformatory's imposing Gothic revival structure, with its soaring limestone towers and elaborate stonework, commanded respect from all who approached its gates along the riverfront. The reformatory's founding charter, preserved in the Detroit Public Library archives, outlined an ambitious mission that reflected the era's optimistic belief in human perfectibility. To provide wayward and orphaned children of Detroit with the moral guidance, educational foundation, and practical skills necessary to become productive members of our great American society. The Gothic Revival architecture, designed by renowned architect James Franklin, featured soaring windows that reached toward heaven, hand-carved limestone facades depicting scenes of biblical redemption, and expansive grounds that stretched along nearly a quarter-mile of prime riverfront property. The building's design deliberately evoked the great cathedrals of Europe, suggesting that the work conducted within was nothing less than sacred. Margaret Wells, the institution's first superintendent, came to Detroit with credentials that impressed even the city's most discerning philanthropists. A graduate of the Hartford Female Seminary and former administrator at the Philadelphia House of Refuge, Wells had written extensively on child welfare reform and had lectured at prestigious institutions throughout the Northeast. Her treatise, The Malleable Mind: Scientific Approaches to Juvenile Correction, was considered groundbreaking in its time and had been translated into German and French for distribution in European reform circles. She advocated for what she called structured rehabilitation through discipline, education, and moral instruction, principles that would later take on sinister meaning within the reformatory's walls. Wells arrived in Detroit in 1886, a year before the reformatory's opening, to personally oversee the institution's establishment. She spent months recruiting staff, designing curricula, and establishing the administrative systems that would govern the facility's operations. Her correspondence from this period, preserved in the Bentley Historical Library at the University of Michigan, reveals a woman of extraordinary attention to detail and unwavering commitment to her vision of scientific child management. She wrote to colleagues about the challenges of creating what she termed a total environment for character reformation. The reformatory's board of directors read like a who's who of Detroit society, representing the cream of the city's industrial and social elite. Charles Baker, president of the Michigan Central Railroad, served as chairman and brought his expertise in large-scale organizational management to the institution's governance. Robert Anderson, owner of the city's largest textile mill, managed finances with the same precision he applied to his business empire. Edward Collins, a prominent attorney who would later serve on the Michigan Supreme Court, oversaw legal affairs and ensured that the reformatory's operations remained within the bounds of existing law. These men, pillars of the community who commanded respect throughout Michigan and beyond, lent their names and reputations to what they genuinely believed was a noble cause. Their involvement signaled to Detroit citizens that the reformatory represented the highest ideals of Christian charity and progressive reform. The board met monthly in the reformatory's elegantly appointed boardroom, where they reviewed reports, approved budgets, and discussed the institution's expanding mission. The institution's early years seemed to justify their faith and vindicate their investment. Local newspapers regularly featured glowing reports of the reformatory's success, with journalists competing to produce the most effusive praise for the institution's achievements. The Detroit Free Press published a lengthy feature in 1891 titled, "From Street Urchins to Useful Citizens, The Coldwater Miracle." The article described clean dormitories with polished floors and crisp linens, well-equipped classrooms where children learned reading and arithmetic, and workshops where young hands learned valuable trades like carpentry, metalworking, and textile production. Distinguished visitors toured the facility regularly, drawn by reports of the reformatory's innovative methods and impressive results. Michigan Governor John Rich visited in 1893, praising the reformatory's systematic approach to moral reformation and declaring it a model for institutions throughout the state. The National Conference of Charities and Corrections held its 1895 annual meeting in Detroit, specifically to showcase the Coldwater model, bringing together child welfare experts from across the nation to study the reformatory's methods. Delegates from across the country toured the grounds, interviewed staff, and returned home with detailed notes and plans to replicate the program in their own states. The reformatory's influence spread rapidly through the professional networks of social workers, educators, and philanthropists who saw in Detroit's experiment a blueprint for addressing the growing problem of urban juvenile delinquency. State legislators from Ohio, Illinois, and Pennsylvania introduced bills to fund similar institutions based on the Coldwater model. The reformatory's reputation extended far beyond Michigan's borders, attracting international attention from reform movements in Europe and Canada. Child welfare reformers from New York, Philadelphia, and Boston made pilgrimages to Detroit to study the Coldwater methods, often spending weeks observing the institution's operations and interviewing staff about their techniques. Margaret Wells was invited to speak at Harvard University's Graduate School of Social Work, where she presented her paper, The Scientific Management of Juvenile Delinquency, to an audience of distinguished academics and practitioners. Academic journals published her research, and she became a sought-after consultant for similar institutions nationwide. Her articles appeared in the American Journal of Sociology, the Annals of the American Academy of Political and Social Science, and the Journal of Criminal Law and Criminology. European reformers translated her work into multiple languages, and she corresponded regularly with colleagues in Germany, France, and England who were implementing similar programs. By 1895, the reformatory housed over 400 children, ranging in age from 8 to 17, making it one of the largest juvenile correction facilities in the Midwest. The facility operated with military precision that impressed visitors and suggested the highest standards of institutional management. The daily routine began with wake-up calls at 5:30 a.m., followed by morning calisthenics conducted in the reformatory's gymnasium, breakfast in the spacious dining hall, 4 hours of classroom instruction in subjects ranging from basic literacy to advanced mathematics, 4 hours of vocational training in the institution's well-equipped workshops, dinner, evening prayers in the reformatory's chapel, and lights out by 8 p.m. Children wore identical grey uniforms that eliminated class distinctions and promoted institutional unity. They were assigned numbers rather than names during daily activities, a practice Wells defended as promoting institutional efficiency and personal discipline, while eliminating the distractions of individual identity. The reformatory's published regulations emphasized order, obedience, and the systematic correction of character flaws that had led to the children's delinquent behavior. The reformatory's success metrics appeared impressive by any measure, surpassing the achievements of similar institutions throughout the country. Annual reports boasted of literacy rates improving from 23% to 87% among incoming children, with some achieving reading levels that exceeded those of their peers in Detroit's public schools. Vocational training programs claimed 94% job placement rates for graduates, with detailed statistics showing former residents employed in respectable occupations throughout the region. The institution's farm, worked entirely by child labor under the supervision of skilled agricultural instructors, produced enough food to feed the entire facility while generating surplus crops sold at Detroit's Eastern Market. The reformatory's agricultural program was praised as both economically efficient and morally beneficial, teaching children the value of honest labor while providing them with skills that would serve them well in rural employment. Local businesses praised the reformatory's graduate program with enthusiasm that reflected their genuine satisfaction with former residents' performance. The Detroit Steelworks regularly hired former Coldwater residents, reporting that these young men possessed exceptional work ethic and respect for authority that made them ideal employees in the demanding industrial environment. The city's domestic service agencies found that young women from the reformatory made ideal household staff, obedient, skilled, and grateful for honest employment. Religious leaders throughout Detroit endorsed the reformatory's spiritual program with unanimous approval that reflected the institution's careful attention to denominational sensitivities. Father Joseph Carter of St. Mary's Catholic Church served as the institution's chaplain, conducting weekly services for Catholic children and providing individual counseling for those struggling with moral questions. Reverend Frank Reynolds of the First Methodist Church led Protestant services, while Rabbi George Mitchell from Temple Beth-El provided religious instruction for Jewish residents. This interfaith approach was considered remarkably progressive for the era and demonstrated the reformatory's commitment to serving all of Detroit's children regardless of their religious background. The reformatory's medical care was overseen by Dr. Thomas Lambert, a respected Detroit physician who had trained at the University of Michigan Medical School and maintained a private practice among the city's elite. Dr. Lambert's monthly reports consistently showed mortality rates well below the national average for similar institutions, suggesting that the reformatory's medical program was among the most advanced in the country. His medical innovations, including what he called therapeutic interventions for chronically disruptive behavior, were featured in the American Journal of Institutional Medicine and attracted attention from physicians working in similar facilities. The institution's educational program, directed by former Detroit Public Schools principal Dorothy Hughes, emphasized practical skills alongside basic literacy and numeracy. Children learned trades that would serve them well in Detroit's growing industrial economy: machining, welding, textile production, and food service. The most promising students could advance to clerical training, learning bookkeeping, typing, and business correspondence. The reformatory's library, funded by a generous donation from the Carnegie Foundation, contained over 5,000 volumes carefully selected to promote moral development and practical education. Margaret Wells maintained extensive correspondence with child welfare reformers across the country, building a network of professional relationships that enhanced the reformatory's reputation and influence. Her letters, preserved in the Bentley Historical Library at the University of Michigan, reveal a woman deeply committed to her mission and convinced of the righteousness of her methods. She wrote to colleagues about the challenges of managing difficult children, the importance of maintaining discipline, and the satisfaction of seeing former residents succeed in the outside world. The reformatory's funding model was considered innovative and sustainable, serving as a template for other institutions seeking financial independence. Beyond the initial endowment from Detroit's industrialists, the institution generated significant revenue through its various enterprises. The laundry service, staffed entirely by children under adult supervision, cleaned linens for Detroit's finest hotels, including the prestigious Russell House and the Cadillac Hotel. The carpentry shop produced custom furniture for wealthy clients, with pieces that were displayed in some of Detroit's most elegant homes. The textile workshop manufactured uniforms for the city's police and fire departments, generating steady income while providing children with valuable industrial skills. By 1900, the Coldwater Children's Reformatory was widely regarded as the most successful juvenile correction facility in the Midwest, setting standards that other institutions struggled to match. Delegations from Chicago, Cleveland, and Cincinnati visited regularly, studying the reformatory's methods and attempting to replicate its success. The Michigan State Legislature held hearings on expanding the Coldwater model to other cities, with lawmakers praising the institution's combination of fiscal responsibility and social effectiveness. Margaret Wells was appointed to the National Commission on Child Welfare, where she helped draft model legislation for juvenile justice reform that would influence policy decisions for decades to come. Her testimony before congressional committees was widely quoted in newspapers and professional journals, establishing her as the nation's leading expert on scientific child management. The reformatory's influence extended into federal policy, with the Bureau of Education incorporating Coldwater methods into its recommendations for institutional reform. The institution's reputation seemed unassailable, supported by documentation and endorsements from the most respected authorities in child welfare. Annual inspections by state officials consistently rated the facility as exemplary, with inspectors praising everything from the cleanliness of the dormitories to the quality of the educational programs. The Detroit Board of Education formally recognized the reformatory's academic program as equivalent to the city's public schools, allowing graduates to receive diplomas that would ease their transition to adult life. The Michigan Department of Health praised the institution's medical care and sanitation practices, noting that the reformatory's health statistics compared favorably with those of much wealthier communities. State medical inspectors found no evidence of the overcrowding, poor nutrition, or inadequate medical care that plagued many similar institutions. The reformatory's infirmary was equipped with modern medical equipment and staffed by qualified nurses who provided round-the-clock care for sick children. Local newspapers continued their positive coverage throughout the 1890s and early 1900s, with journalists competing to produce the most glowing accounts of the reformatory's achievements. The Detroit News featured regular human interest stories about former residents who had gone on to successful careers, including profiles of young men who had become skilled craftsmen and young women who had married respectably and were raising families. The Michigan Catholic featured articles about the reformatory's interfaith approach to spiritual guidance, praising the institution's ability to serve children of all religious backgrounds. Even national publications like Harper's Weekly and The Atlantic Monthly published favorable pieces about the Coldwater model, bringing the reformatory's methods to the attention of readers throughout the country. These articles typically emphasized the scientific nature of the reformatory's approach, contrasting it favorably with the harsh, punitive methods employed by traditional correctional institutions. The reformatory was portrayed as a beacon of enlightened thinking in an era when most juvenile offenders were simply imprisoned alongside adult criminals. The reformatory's success attracted significant additional funding from philanthropic organizations and individual donors who saw the institution as a worthy investment in social progress. The Carnegie Foundation provided grants for library expansion and educational equipment. The Rockefeller Foundation supported medical research initiatives and funded scholarships for deserving graduates. Local philanthropists continued to contribute generously, viewing the institution as one of Detroit's crown jewels and a source of civic pride. As the 20th century dawned, the Coldwater Children's Reformatory stood as a monument to progressive ideals and scientific management, representing the best hopes of a society committed to the perfectibility of human nature through rational intervention. Its imposing Gothic towers, manicured grounds, and reputation for excellence masked the dark reality that was beginning to emerge in whispered conversations among Detroit's working-class neighborhoods, conversations that would soon become impossible to ignore. Ignored signs. The first cracks in the Coldwater Children's Reformatory's pristine facade appeared in the summer of 1901, though they were easily dismissed by those who preferred not to. Look too closely. Ruth Palmer, a laundress who worked for the Detroit Hotel Supply Company and processed linens from various institutions throughout the city, began noticing troubling patterns in the materials she received from the reformatory. Sheets and clothing arrived stained with what appeared to be blood, often in suspicious patterns that suggested struggle rather than accident. The stains were concentrated in areas that indicated restraint, around wrists, ankles, and necks, and were accompanied by tears and damage that seemed inconsistent with normal childhood accidents. When Ruth Palmer mentioned her concerns to her supervisor, she was told that growing boys are naturally rough, and that accidents happen in any active institution. Her supervisor, who depended on the reformatory's business, instructed her to focus on cleaning rather than questioning the sources of stains. Palmer, a widow with 3 children to support, could not afford to lose her employment, but she began keeping a private log of her observations in a small notebook that she hid beneath her mattress. The reformatory's location along the Detroit River, initially chosen for its scenic beauty and therapeutic potential, began to take on darker significance as local residents noticed disturbing patterns in what washed ashore. Walter Green, a veteran angler who worked the river daily from dawn to dusk, kept a private log of his discoveries that painted an increasingly troubling picture. In September 1901, he found a child's shoe, a small brown boot with the initials EM carved into the leather. In November, a torn schoolbook with pages that had been deliberately ripped out. In January 1902, a small wooden cross with a chain that had been broken, as if torn from someone's neck by force. When Walter Green approached the reformatory's administration about these findings, Margaret Wells dismissed them as refuse from the city's various charitable institutions and explained that items often fell from boats or were discarded by picnickers along the riverbank. She suggested that Green's concerns reflected an overactive imagination, and hinted that his continued questioning might indicate that he was seeking attention through sensational claims. Green, intimidated by Wells's response and concerned about his reputation in the community, stopped reporting his discoveries but continued documenting them in his private records. The reformatory's impressive job placement statistics began to unravel under scrutiny from an unexpected source. Arthur Newman, a meticulous clerk at the Detroit Labor Exchange who prided himself on maintaining accurate employment records, noticed that many of the placement records for former Coldwater residents contained inconsistencies that troubled his bureaucratic sensibilities. Employers listed in official reports denied ever hiring these individuals when Newman attempted to verify their current employment status. Some of the businesses cited in placement success stories had been closed for years, while others claimed no knowledge of the workers supposedly placed with them. When Newman attempted to verify the whereabouts of specific graduates by contacting the addresses listed in the reformatory's records, he found that their trails simply ended at the reformatory's gates. Former residents seemed to vanish into thin air after their supposed graduation, leaving no trace in city directories, employment records, or any other official documentation. Newman's efforts to track down even a handful of the hundreds of supposed success stories resulted in dead ends and contradictory information that suggested systematic falsification of records. Harold Price, a reporter for the Detroit Journal who specialized in investigative pieces about municipal corruption, began investigating these discrepancies after receiving a confidential tip from Newman. His initial inquiries to the reformatory were met with polite deflection and carefully rehearsed responses. Wells explained that tracking former residents was challenging because successful graduates naturally wish to leave their troubled past behind and often change their names or move to other cities to escape the stigma of their institutional experience. She provided Price with a list of businesses that had employed Coldwater graduates, but when he attempted to verify these claims through direct interviews, he found a pattern of evasion and contradictory information. Business owners either claimed no knowledge of hiring former reformatory residents or provided vague accounts that seemed scripted and unconvincing. Price's investigation revealed that several of the businesses cited in the reformatory's reports were owned by board members or their associates, suggesting potential conflicts of interest in the placement process. The reformatory's mortality records, once a source of pride for Dr. Thomas Lambert and the medical staff, began to raise questions among Detroit's medical community as physicians compared notes during professional gatherings. Dr. Raymond Elliott, a physician who served on the city's health board and maintained detailed statistics on childhood mortality throughout Detroit, noticed that deaths at Coldwater were consistently attributed to common childhood diseases, measles, pneumonia, typhoid, but at rates that seemed statistically unlikely for an institution with such acclaimed medical care. When Dr. Elliott requested detailed medical records for review by the health board, hoping to understand how the reformatory achieved such impressive overall health statistics, despite these occasional outbreaks, he was told that patient confidentiality prevented such disclosure. Margaret Wells explained that the reformatory's medical records contained sensitive information about children's backgrounds and behavioral problems that could not be shared with outside authorities without explicit permission from each child's family, permission that was rarely granted and often impossible to obtain. Parents and family members began voicing concerns that had previously been dismissed as the complaints of society's less respectable elements. Albert Fisher, a hard-working dock worker whose 13-year-old son had been committed to Coldwater for truancy after missing too many days of school while helping support the family, had not seen the boy since his admission 8 months earlier. When Fisher attempted to visit, traveling to the reformatory on his only day off from the docks, he was told that his son was undergoing intensive rehabilitation and that family contact would be counterproductive to his progress. Fisher's increasingly desperate letters to the reformatory went unanswered, forcing him to seek help from local clergy and social workers who showed sympathy but claimed they had no authority to intervene in the reformatory's internal policies. When Fisher appeared at the reformatory's gates demanding to see his son, he was turned away by security guards who threatened to have him arrested for trespassing. The experience left Fisher feeling powerless and convinced that the system was designed to keep working-class parents away from their children. Carl Bennett, whose 12-year-old daughter had been sent to Coldwater after being found living on the streets following her mother's death from tuberculosis, experienced similar treatment from the reformatory's staff. The reformatory's social worker, Eugene Hoffman, assured Bennett that the girl was thriving in our structured environment, but explained that visits would have to wait until she had fully internalized our moral teachings. Bennett's requests for letters from his daughter were denied on the grounds that external correspondence might trigger behavioral regression. Bennett, who worked nights as a janitor to support himself and pay for a small room where he hoped to eventually bring his daughter home, saved every penny he could to hire an attorney. However, the lawyer he consulted explained that parents who voluntarily surrendered children to the reformatory had limited legal rights and that challenging the institution's policies would be expensive and likely unsuccessful. The attorney suggested that Bennett's best option was to wait patiently and trust the reformatory's expertise. The reformatory's financial records, once a model of transparency that had impressed auditors and donors, began showing unexplained expenditures that caught the attention of careful observers. Ralph Daniels, an experienced accountant who prepared the institution's annual reports and took pride in maintaining meticulous financial documentation, noticed significant payments to companies that provided no clear services to the reformatory's stated mission. When Daniels asked Wells about these expenses, she explained they were for specialized therapeutic equipment and training materials that were essential to our advanced rehabilitation methods. The equipment was purportedly so specialized that it had to be purchased from specific vendors who demanded confidentiality agreements to protect their proprietary methods. Daniels found this explanation unsatisfying, but was reminded that his contract required him to prepare reports based on information provided by the reformatory's administration, rather than to conduct independent investigations. Local businesses that had once praised the reformatory's graduates began experiencing problems that suggested something was seriously wrong with the institution's training programs. Lawrence Harper, owner of a small manufacturing concern that had hired several former Coldwater residents over the years, noticed that these employees, while initially compliant and hard-working, often displayed strange behaviors that set them apart from other workers. They seemed fearful of authority figures to an unusual degree, reluctant to speak about their experiences even in casual conversation, and prone to sudden disappearances without notice. Some would simply fail to appear for work one day and never return, leaving behind few personal possessions and no forwarding addresses. When Harper attempted to contact the reformatory about these issues, hoping to better understand how to help these young people adjust to employment, his calls went unreturned and his letters were ignored. The reformatory's educational achievements also came under scrutiny from educators who had occasion to evaluate children who had transferred from Coldwater to public schools or other institutions. Ernest Chapman, a teacher at a nearby public school who prided himself on his ability to assess students' academic preparation, had occasion to evaluate several children who had been transferred from the reformatory due to family circumstances or court orders. Despite the institution's claims of academic excellence and innovative educational methods, these students showed significant gaps in their knowledge and displayed what Chapman described as institutional behaviors that interfered with their learning. They seemed unable to think independently, showed excessive deference to authority that prevented them from asking questions or expressing curiosity, and displayed obvious signs of physical and psychological trauma that suggested harsh treatment rather than nurturing education. The city's social workers began noting disturbing patterns in their case files that suggested the reformatory was using its influence to silence critics and protect its operations. Samuel Warren, who managed child welfare cases for the city and maintained detailed records of his interactions with various institutions, observed that families who questioned the reformatory's methods or demanded access to their children often found themselves subjected to official harassment that seemed designed to discourage further inquiries. Parents lost jobs after their employers received visits from city officials questioning their reliability and character. Families had their remaining children taken away based on anonymous reports of neglect or abuse that were later proven false, but only after months of legal proceedings. Some parents were charged with various minor offenses, public drunkenness disturbing the peace, failure to pay taxes, that resulted in jail time or fines they couldn't afford. The pattern was too consistent to be coincidental and suggested a coordinated effort to intimidate potential critics. The reformatory's medical staff turnover began attracting attention from physicians throughout Detroit who wondered why qualified doctors would leave such a prestigious position. Dr. Thomas Lambert, the institution's respected physician who had built the medical program's reputation, had quietly left Detroit in 1902 without notice, abandoning a thriving private practice and leaving behind property and personal belongings. His replacement, Dr. Roy Fletcher, stayed less than a year before also departing abruptly, claiming family emergencies that required his immediate relocation. The third physician, Dr. Howard Baldwin, seemed to have no medical credentials that could be verified through legitimate channels. When questioned about these changes by concerned colleagues, Wells explained that personnel decisions are made based on the institution's evolving needs, and that the reformatory required doctors who specialized in institutional medicine rather than traditional private practice. She hinted that the previous physicians had been unable to adapt to the demanding requirements of working with difficult children who required specialized treatment approaches. Strange incidents began occurring around the reformatory grounds that suggested activities inconsistent with the institution's stated mission. Fred Powers, a maintenance worker employed by the city to service municipal buildings, reported seeing children working in the institution's basement workshops well past midnight when he was called to repair water pipes in the area. The children appeared to be operating machinery and moving heavy materials under minimal adult supervision, working by lamplight in conditions that seemed dangerous and inappropriate for young people. When Powers mentioned this to his supervisor, hoping to ensure that proper safety protocols were being followed, he was told that the reformatory operates on its own schedule, and that city workers should focus on their assigned duties rather than questioning the methods of respected charitable institutions. Powers noticed that the basement windows were often covered with thick curtains, and that unusual sounds, what he described as machinery mixed with crying, emanated from the building at all hours when normal institutional activities should have ceased. The reformatory's laundry service, once a source of pride and steady income, began experiencing problems with its clientele that suggested declining quality and reliability. Harry Doyle, manager of the prestigious Grand Hotel who had initially praised the reformatory's laundry service, cancelled his contract with Coldwater after repeatedly receiving linens that were inadequately cleaned and bore suspicious stains that his housekeeping staff found disturbing. When Doyle complained to the reformatory about the declining quality of service, he was told that minor imperfections are inevitable in any large-scale operation and that the charitable nature of our enterprise should be considered when evaluating the service provided. The dismissive response offended Doyle, who had been willing to overlook occasional problems out of sympathy for the reformatory's mission, but found the institution's attitude toward legitimate complaints unprofessional and concerning. Local clergy began expressing private concerns about the reformatory's religious programs that suggested something was seriously wrong with the institution's spiritual guidance. Father Joseph Carter, who had served as chaplain since the reformatory's opening, confided to colleagues that he had witnessed troubling scenes during his visits that challenged his understanding of Christian charity and proper treatment of children. Children seemed unusually fearful and subdued during services, responding to questions with mechanical answers that suggested coaching rather than genuine spiritual understanding. When Father Carter attempted to speak privately with individual children about their spiritual needs and personal concerns, he was told that one-on-one counseling might interfere with group discipline, and that all interactions with residents had to be supervised by reformatory staff. His requests for more access to the children were denied, and he was eventually replaced by a chaplain who was less inquisitive about the reformatory's methods. The institution's impressive visitor program also began showing cracks that suggested careful orchestration, designed to hide rather than reveal the reformatory's true operations. Clarence West, a member of the Michigan legislature who had toured the facility in 1903 as part of a committee investigating state funding for similar institutions, later told colleagues that his visit had felt carefully orchestrated in ways that seemed designed to prevent genuine observation. He was shown only certain areas of the building, always following predetermined routes that avoided entire sections of the facility. He met only selected children who seemed to recite prepared speeches rather than engaging in natural conversation about their experiences. When West asked about areas of the building that were off-limits to the tour, he was told they were under renovation or used for confidential medical treatments that could not be disturbed by visitors. The reformatory's correspondence with other institutions began revealing inconsistencies that suggested systematic deception about the fate of former residents. Donald Freeman, who managed a similar facility in Cleveland and maintained regular professional correspondence with reformatories throughout the Midwest, noticed that his requests for information about former Coldwater residents were met with vague responses or outright denials that such individuals had ever been housed there. When Freeman attempted to verify the reformatory's claimed success rates by following up on specific cases mentioned in professional publications, he found that the supporting documentation was either incomplete or impossible to authenticate. The reformatory's representatives became evasive when pressed for details and seemed reluctant to provide the kind of professional cooperation that was standard among similar institutions. The Detroit Police Department began receiving reports about the reformatory that were handled through special procedures that suggested official efforts to suppress investigation. Jack Morrison, a veteran detective who prided himself on thorough investigation of all complaints, noted that cases involving the reformatory were routinely filed in a special category that required approval from senior officers before any action could be taken. Morrison observed that these cases typically resulted in no action, with complainants often being warned about making false allegations against a respected charitable institution. The warnings were accompanied by suggestions that continued complaints might result in charges of harassment or defamation, effectively silencing most critics. Morrison began to suspect that the reformatory's influential board members were using their connections to protect the institution from scrutiny. By 1904, the accumulated weight of these ignored signs had created an undercurrent of concern among Detroit's more observant citizens who were beginning to question the gap between the reformatory's public image and the troubling reports that circulated in working-class neighborhoods. However, the institution's powerful supporters, impressive facilities, and carefully maintained public image continued to shield it from serious scrutiny. The reformatory's board of directors remained confident in their mission and continued to receive accolades for their charitable work from religious and civic organizations throughout the region. Margaret Wells continued to be featured as a speaker at professional conferences and received honors from national child welfare organizations. The truth about what was happening within the limestone walls of the Coldwater Children's Reformatory would require more than whispered concerns and unanswered questions to emerge. It would require someone brave enough to speak the unspeakable and risk everything to expose the horrors that lay beneath. The institution's veneer of respectability. Horror uncovered. The facade of the Coldwater Children's Reformatory began to crumble in the spring of 1905, when 15-year-old Mary Sullivan managed to escape from the institution's supposedly secure grounds under circumstances that revealed the true nature of the horrors occurring within its walls. Sullivan, who had been committed to Coldwater 2 years earlier for stealing bread from a bakery to feed her younger siblings, arrived at the Detroit police station in a state of physical and psychological collapse that shocked even hardened officers accustomed to witnessing human suffering. Her appearance provided undeniable evidence of systematic abuse that could no longer be dismissed or explained away. She was severely malnourished, weighing barely 70 pounds despite being of average height for her age. Her body bore evidence of systematic physical abuse that included scars from what appeared to be deliberate cutting, burns that suggested torture with heated implements, and injuries that indicated prolonged restraint with ropes or chains. Dr. Helen Brooks, the police department's consulting physician, who had examined victims of industrial accidents and domestic violence throughout her career, described Sullivan's condition as trauma consistent with prolonged torture, and stated that she had never seen such extensive evidence of systematic cruelty inflicted on a child. Sullivan's initial testimony, transcribed by police stenographer Dorothy Hughes, in a process that took several days due to the girl's trauma-induced speech difficulties, revealed horrors that challenged comprehension and exposed the reformatory as something far more sinister than a misguided charitable institution. She spoke of children being subjected to what the reformatory staff called corrective treatments, procedures that bore no resemblance to any legitimate medical or educational practice, but were instead sophisticated methods of torture designed to break children's will and eliminate any resistance to the institution's control. According to Sullivan's detailed account, children who displayed resistant behavior, which could include anything from asking questions about missing friends to expressing desire to contact family members, were taken to the institution's basement during the night hours when the regular staff had departed. The basement facilities, which had never been included in official tours or mentioned in any of the reformatory's promotional materials, contained what Sullivan described as medical equipment that was actually an elaborate collection of instruments designed for inflicting pain and psychological trauma. Children were strapped to metal tables using leather restraints that left permanent marks on their wrists and ankles. They were subjected to procedures that Margaret Wells had termed therapeutic interventions in her private notes, which Sullivan had been forced to transcribe as part of her work assignment in the administrative office. These included forced immersion in ice water for extended periods, administration of unknown drugs that caused hallucinations and violent illness, and physical modifications that Wells claimed would reduce criminal tendencies. Through scientific adjustment of problematic behaviors, Sullivan's testimony revealed that the reformatory maintained detailed records of these procedures in files kept in Wells's private office, which was locked and guarded, but which Sullivan had accessed during her clerical duties. The records contained photographs documenting the progress of various treatments, medical notes describing children's responses to different forms of abuse, and behavioral assessments that tracked the effectiveness of torture in achieving compliance. The documentation was extensive and methodical, suggesting that the abuse was not random cruelty, but part of a systematic experimental program. The escaped girl's account of the reformatory's daily operations bore no resemblance to the institution's public image or the carefully orchestrated tours provided to visitors. Children were awakened at 4 a.m., not 5:30 as claimed in official reports, and were immediately subjected to morning discipline that included physical exercises designed to exhaust and humiliate rather than promote health. They were given minimal food, a thin gruel made from spoiled grain for breakfast, watery soup with occasional scraps of rotten vegetables for lunch, and stale bread with rare portions of meat so rancid that many children became violently ill. Children who complained of hunger or requested additional food were subjected to discipline treatments that included forced labor in the basement workshops where they operated dangerous machinery without proper training or safety equipment, solitary confinement in small cells that were barely large enough for a child to lie down, and what staff members euphemistically called behavior modification sessions that involved various forms of physical and psychological torture designed to eliminate any expression of individual will or desire. The reformatory's educational program was largely fictional, according to Sullivan's detailed observations. Children spent minimal time in actual classrooms, and the instruction they received consisted primarily of rote memorization of moral platitudes and basic arithmetic skills needed for factory work. Instead of receiving the comprehensive education described in the reformatory's promotional materials, children were put to work in various enterprises that generated substantial profit for the institution while providing them with no useful skills or knowledge. The laundry service, carpentry shop, and textile workshop were operated entirely by child labor under conditions that violated even the minimal worker protection laws of the era. Children worked 12 to 14 hours per day operating dangerous machinery, handling caustic chemicals, and performing heavy manual labor that would have been considered excessive for adult workers. Those who became ill or injured were not provided medical care, but were instead subjected to additional treatments designed to improve their resistance to weakness and eliminate their tendency toward malingering. Sullivan's testimony about the reformatory's medical practices revealed systematic abuse masked as scientific research that had been conducted with the knowledge and approval of the institution's board of directors. Dr. Thomas Lambert, the institution's former physician who had built the medical program's reputation, had not left Detroit voluntarily as claimed in official reports. He had been dismissed after objecting to procedures that he characterized as human experimentation and threatening to report the institution's activities to medical authorities. His replacement, Dr. Howard Baldwin, had no legitimate medical credentials, but was instead what Sullivan described as a man who enjoyed causing pain and who had been hired specifically for his willingness to participate in the torture of children. Baldwin conducted what he called medical research that involved deliberately infecting children with diseases, performing surgical procedures without anesthesia, and testing various drugs and chemical compounds to observe their effects on young subjects. The girl's account of the reformatory's mortality rates exposed a massive cover-up that explained the discrepancies noted by outside observers. Children who died during treatments were not included in official death records submitted to city and state authorities. Instead, their deaths were attributed to various causes that would not prompt investigation, listed as runaways who had presumably left the institution, transfers to other facilities that existed only on paper, or natural deaths from common illnesses that were documented with forged death certificates. The actual number of deaths was far higher than reported, with Sullivan estimating that at least one child died every week from the abuse they suffered. Bodies were disposed of in ways that prevented discovery, including burial in unmarked graves on the reformatory's grounds, disposal in the Detroit River during nighttime hours, and cremation in furnaces that had been installed in the basement supposedly for heating purposes, but were actually used to destroy evidence of the institution's crimes. Sullivan revealed that the reformatory maintained a network of complicit individuals throughout Detroit's government and business community who received regular payments to ensure that investigations were quashed, complaints were dismissed, and the institution's activities remained hidden from public scrutiny. The reformatory's financial records, which she had been forced to transcribe and organize, contained detailed documentation of these payments disguised as consulting fees, equipment purchases, and charitable donations. City officials, police officers, judges, and prominent citizens were all part of a corruption network that protected the reformatory in exchange for financial benefits and other considerations. The payments were substantial and regular, suggesting that the reformatory's criminal activities generated enormous profits that could support extensive bribery while still enriching the institution's administrators and board members. The most horrifying aspect of Sullivan's testimony concerned the fate of children who showed particular resistance to the reformatory's methods or who possessed knowledge that could expose the institution's crimes. These children, labeled as incorrigible cases in the reformatory's internal documentation, were subjected to what Wells called terminal treatments, procedures designed to permanently resolve behavioral problems through methods that invariably resulted in the child's death or complete psychological breakdown. Sullivan had witnessed several of these treatments during her time in the basement workshops, where she had been assigned to clean equipment and dispose of materials used in the torture sessions. Children selected for terminal treatment were subjected to prolonged torture designed to cause maximum suffering before death, with their final moments documented in photographs and detailed notes that were kept in Wells's private collection. Following Sullivan's testimony, Detective Jack Morrison began a covert investigation of the reformatory that utilized his network of informants and his knowledge of police procedures to gather evidence while avoiding the corruption that had previously protected the institution. Morrison, who had been suspicious of the reformatory for years based on the patterns he had observed in missing persons reports and unexplained deaths, used his connections in the Detroit Police Department to identify other officers who shared his concerns and could be trusted to assist in the investigation. Morrison's investigation uncovered additional witnesses who had been too frightened to speak previously, but were inspired by Sullivan's courage to come forward with their own accounts of the reformatory's crimes. Margaret Wells, a former kitchen worker at the reformatory who shared a name with the institution's superintendent, had witnessed children being taken from their dormitories late at night and had heard screaming from the basement areas. That continued for hours. She had quit her job after being threatened by supervisory staff, who warned her that speaking about her experiences would result in serious consequences for her family. Wells provided Morrison with detailed information about the reformatory's food service operations, which were designed to maximize profits while providing children with barely enough nutrition to survive. Food that was unfit for human consumption was routinely served to the children, while the high-quality meals described in official reports were prepared only when visitors were present. The kitchen staff was instructed to prepare 2 different sets of meals, one for display purposes and another for actual consumption by the residents. Ruth Palmer, the laundress who had noticed suspicious stains on the reformatory's linens, provided Morrison with detailed records she had kept of her observations in a notebook that she had hidden in her home. Her logs revealed patterns of blood-stained clothing that coincided with periods of increased disciplinary action at the institution, with some items so heavily soaked in blood that they could not be cleaned and had to be destroyed. Kalmer had also discovered items of clothing that had been cut away from bodies rather than removed normally, suggesting that children had been subjected to procedures that required the rapid removal of their garments. Some items showed evidence of burning or chemical damage that indicated exposure to substances used in torture sessions. Palmer's records provided crucial corroborating evidence for Sullivan's claims about the systematic nature of the abuse. Morrison's investigation revealed that the reformatory's impressive job placement statistics were entirely fabricated, created to maintain the institution's reputation, while hiding the fact that most children never left the facility alive. The businesses listed as employers of former residents either did not exist, had never hired these individuals, or were owned by associates of the reformatory who participated in the deception in exchange for financial compensation. The successful graduates featured in the institution's promotional materials were fictional characters created to support the reformatory's claims of rehabilitation success. The photographs used in these materials were either of children who had died at the reformatory or of individuals who had no connection to the institution but whose images had been purchased or stolen for promotional purposes. The detectives' inquiries into the reformatory's financial records revealed massive fraud that extended far beyond the falsification of placement statistics. The institution had been billing the city and state for services that were never provided, including educational programs that existed only on paper, medical care that consisted of torture rather than treatment, and food service that provided children with inadequate nutrition while claiming to offer high-quality meals. The reformatory had been selling products manufactured by child labor, while claiming that the proceeds supported educational programs and facility improvements. In reality, the profits were divided among the institution's administrators and used to fund the network of corruption that protected the facility from investigation. The financial records also revealed payments for specialized equipment that was used for torture rather than legitimate institutional purposes. Morrison discovered that the reformatory's medical records had been systematically falsified to hide the true extent of injuries and deaths among the resident population. Death certificates for children who had died at the institution bore forged signatures from legitimate physicians who had never examined these patients, including Dr. Raymond Elliott and other respected members of Detroit's medical community whose names had been used without their knowledge or consent. The causes of death listed on these documents were chosen to deflect suspicion and prevent investigation, with most deaths attributed to common childhood diseases that would not prompt questions about the institution's treatment methods. The forged medical records were sophisticated enough to pass casual inspection, but contained subtle inconsistencies that revealed their fraudulent nature to careful examination. The detectives' investigation also revealed the existence of a network of similar institutions throughout Michigan and neighboring states that operated using identical methods and maintained regular correspondence about their research findings. The reformatory was not an isolated case of institutional abuse, but part of a broader system of exploitation that involved multiple facilities coordinating their activities and sharing information about effective torture techniques. Margaret Wells maintained correspondence with administrators at similar institutions in Ohio, Illinois, and Pennsylvania, exchanging information about methods for breaking children's resistance and developing new techniques for maintaining control over large populations of unwilling subjects. The network included facilities that were officially described as orphanages, reform schools, and charitable institutions, but were actually centers for systematic child abuse, operating under the protection of respected religious and civic organizations. Morrison's evidence gathering was complicated by the reformatory's powerful supporters, who used their influence to obstruct the investigation and protect their investment in the institution. When the detective attempted to interview board members about their knowledge of the reformatory's activities, he discovered that several had quietly resigned their positions and left Detroit without explanation, taking with them any documentation that might have revealed their involvement in the crimes. Others refused to speak with Morrison, claiming that their association with the institution had been minimal and that they had no knowledge of its actual operations. Some board members retained prominent attorneys who threatened legal action against Morrison and the police department if the investigation continued, claiming that the detectives' inquiries constituted harassment of respected citizens engaged in charitable work. The detectives' investigation revealed that the reformatory's religious programs had been used to identify and exploit vulnerable children rather than provide genuine spiritual guidance. The institution's chaplains had been instructed to report children who seemed particularly isolated or fearful, as these individuals were considered ideal subjects for the facility's experimental treatments due to their limited connections to the outside world, and reduced likelihood of being missed if they disappeared. The chaplains were also used to reinforce the psychological control exercised over the children, preaching sermons that emphasized obedience to authority and the sinfulness of questioning institutional policies. Children who expressed doubts about the reformatory's methods or attempted to seek help through religious channels were subjected to additional punishment designed to eliminate their faith and destroy their hope of rescue. Morrison discovered that the reformatory maintained detailed psychological profiles of its residents that documented their fears, weaknesses, and behavioral patterns in order to design individualized torture protocols that would be most effective in breaking each child's resistance to the institution's control. The profiles included information about family relationships, personal traumatic experiences, and individual personality traits that could be exploited to maximize psychological damage. The psychological profiling was conducted by staff members who had been trained in techniques developed specifically for the reformatory's purposes, combining elements of emerging psychological theories with practical experience in breaking human resistance. The profiles were updated regularly based on children's responses to various treatments, creating a comprehensive database of information about effective torture methods for different personality types. The detective's investigation revealed that the reformatory staff had been trained in techniques designed to prevent children from reporting abuse to outside authorities or escaping from the facility. These methods included psychological manipulation that convinced children they were responsible for their own suffering, threats against family members that discouraged attempts to seek help, and the use of drugs that caused memory loss and confusion to prevent coherent reporting of abuse. The staff received regular training in these techniques from experts who traveled between similar institutions throughout the region, sharing knowledge about effective methods for maintaining control over large populations of unwilling subjects. The training included instruction in the use of psychological pressure, physical intimidation, and chemical substances to ensure compliance and prevent resistance. Morrison's evidence gathering was supported by additional testimony from former residents who had been inspired by Mary Sullivan's courage to come forward with their own accounts of the systematic abuse they had suffered. These individuals, now adults who had somehow survived their experiences and managed to build lives outside the institution, provided accounts that corroborated Sullivan's claims and revealed additional details about the reformatory's operations that had not been previously documented. The accumulated evidence presented a picture of an institution that had used the cover of charitable work to conduct systematic abuse of children on an unprecedented scale, combining elements of human experimentation, slave labor, and organized crime under the protection of religious and civic respectability. The Coldwater Children's Reformatory was not a misguided experiment in child welfare that had gone wrong. It was a carefully planned and executed operation designed to exploit society's most vulnerable members while maintaining the appearance of progressive reform and generating substantial profits for its operators and protectors. Legacy and silence. The evidence compiled by Detective Jack Morrison and corroborated by Mary Sullivan's testimony should have resulted in immediate action against the Coldwater Children's Reformatory, with arrests, prosecutions, and a thorough investigation that would have exposed the full extent of the institution's crimes. Instead, what followed was a masterclass in institutional cover-up that demonstrated how effectively powerful interests could suppress even the most damning evidence when the stakes were high enough and the perpetrators possessed sufficient influence to manipulate the machinery of justice. The investigation that began in the spring of 1905 was quietly transferred from Morrison to Detective Fred Powers, who had a well-established reputation for handling sensitive cases with discretion rather than thoroughness. Powers, who had previously been involved in suppressing investigations into corruption among city officials and had received substantial payments from various business interests for his cooperation, was explicitly instructed to conduct his inquiry in a manner that would minimize damage to the reformatory's reputation and protect the prominent citizens who served on its board. Within weeks of the investigation's transfer, key witnesses began disappearing or recanting their statements under circumstances that suggested systematic intimidation. Mary Sullivan, who had provided the initial testimony that exposed the reformatory's true nature and had courageously endured hours of questioning despite her traumatic experiences, was found dead in her boarding house room on June 15, 1905. The official cause of death was listed as suicide by laudanum poisoning, despite the fact that Sullivan had shown no signs of depression and had been actively cooperating with the investigation while expressing hope that her testimony would help other children. The scene of Sullivan's death contained several inconsistencies that suggested murder rather than suicide, including evidence that she had struggled with an intruder and the presence of laudanum in quantities that would have been impossible for her to obtain legally. Her personal effects, including detailed notes she had made about her experiences at the reformatory and names of other children who had been subjected to abuse, were seized by police and subsequently lost in the department's evidence storage system. No investigation was conducted into the circumstances of her death, and the case was closed within days of its opening. Margaret Wells, the kitchen worker who had corroborated Sullivan's account with her own observations of children being taken for nighttime torture sessions, suddenly left Detroit without notice just 3 days after Sullivan's death. Her landlord reported that her belongings had been removed by city officials who claimed she had been relocated for her protection but could provide no documentation or explanation for this action. Attempts to trace Wells' whereabouts proved futile, and she was never seen in Detroit again. Her family in rural Michigan received a letter claiming she had moved to California for health reasons, but the handwriting did not match Wells' normal script, and the letter contained information that suggested it had been written by someone unfamiliar with her personal circumstances. Ruth Palmer, the laundress who had documented suspicious stains on the reformatory's linens with meticulous detail, suffered a similar fate. Her employer reported that she had been transferred to another facility, but could provide no details about her new location or the circumstances of her departure. Palmer's notebook containing records of her observations disappeared from her home, along with other personal items that might have provided evidence of the reformatory's crimes. Her neighbors reported seeing well-dressed men removing items from her residence in the middle of the night, but no official explanation was ever provided for this activity. The reformatory's board of directors moved quickly to contain the scandal and protect their investment in the institution. Charles Baker, the railroad president who chaired the board, convened an emergency meeting on June 20, 1905, attended by all surviving board members and several prominent citizens who had financial interests in maintaining the reformatory's operations. The minutes of this meeting, discovered decades later in Baker's personal papers during the settlement of his estate, revealed a coordinated effort to suppress the investigation and eliminate any evidence that could expose the institution's crimes. The board authorized significant payments to city officials, police officers, newspaper editors, and judicial authorities to ensure that the story would not reach the public and that any legal proceedings would be handled in a manner favorable to the reformatory's interests. The payments were substantial, totaling over $50,000, equivalent to millions in modern currency, and were distributed through a network of intermediaries to avoid creating a direct paper trail that could be traced back to the reformatory or its supporters. Margaret Wells, the reformatory's superintendent, was quietly removed from her position and relocated to a similar facility in Oregon under circumstances that suggested she possessed information that could damage her former employers if she chose to reveal it. The official explanation was that she had been offered a prestigious opportunity to expand her innovative methods to the West Coast, but private correspondence revealed that her departure was part of a carefully negotiated agreement that provided her with substantial financial compensation in exchange for her permanent silence about the reformatory's activities. Her departure was reported in the Detroit newspapers as a loss for the city's progressive reform movement, with articles praising her contributions to child welfare and expressing regret that Detroit could not retain such a talented administrator. No mention was made of the investigation that had prompted her removal, and Wells herself issued a public statement expressing her gratitude for the opportunity to serve Detroit's children and her excitement about bringing her methods to a new region. The reformatory itself underwent a carefully orchestrated transformation designed to eliminate evidence of past crimes while maintaining the appearance of legitimate reform. The basement areas where the most serious abuse had occurred were sealed off and declared structurally unsound, with official engineering reports documenting foundation problems that required extensive renovations. In reality, the basement was filled with concrete after the removal of torture equipment and the destruction of any physical evidence that could link the reformatory to the abuse of children. The institution's medical records, which had documented the systematic torture and murder of hundreds of children, were removed from the facility and transferred to a more secure facility for preservation. The records were actually destroyed, burned in furnaces that had previously been used to dispose of children's bodies. The staff members who had been most directly involved in the abuse were quietly dismissed and provided with glowing references that enabled them to find similar positions in other states, where they could their criminal activities without the risk of exposure. A new superintendent, Dr. Clarence West, was appointed to manage the reformatory's transition to improved methodologies. West, who had previously managed a similar institution in Ohio without attracting negative attention, was tasked with implementing reforms that would prevent future scandals while maintaining the institution's core function as a source of profit for its operators. His first act was to destroy all records from the Wells administration, claiming that a fresh start required eliminating outdated documentation that might interfere with modern methods. The city's political establishment closed ranks around the reformatory, with unanimous support that demonstrated the extent of the corruption network that protected the institution. Mayor Donald Freeman issued a statement praising the institution's commitment to continuous improvement and denying that any serious problems had existed under the previous administration. He characterized the investigation as a misunderstanding based on isolated incidents that were blown out of proportion by individuals seeking to damage the reputation of a respected charitable institution. The Detroit Board of Health conducted a perfunctory inspection that found the facility to be in full compliance with all applicable standards, despite the fact that the inspection was announced in advance and the reformatory had weeks to prepare for the visit. The inspection team was composed of individuals who had received payments from the reformatory or who had other financial interests in ensuring a favorable report. Their findings were published in local newspapers as evidence that the reformatory had never posed any danger to the children in its care. The Michigan State Legislature, which had once held hearings on expanding the Coldwater model to other cities throughout the state, quietly tabled all related legislation without explanation. Legislators who had previously praised the reformatory's methods suddenly found other priorities for their attention, and the institutional reform movement that had been gaining momentum throughout the Midwest lost its primary example of successful innovation. The surviving children at the reformatory faced a campaign of intimidation and manipulation designed to prevent them from speaking about their experiences to outside authorities. Those who had been potential witnesses to the most serious crimes were transferred to other institutions in distant states, often under false names that made it impossible for family members or investigators to trace their whereabouts. The transfers were documented as routine administrative decisions based on the children's special needs or behavioral requirements. Others were released to families who had been warned that any public statements about the reformatory would result in serious consequences for both the children and their relatives. The warnings were delivered by well-dressed men who claimed to represent charitable organizations, but who made it clear that they possessed detailed information about the family's personal lives and could cause significant problems if their instructions were not followed. The few children who remained at the facility were subjected to what the new administration called memory therapy, drug treatments that caused confusion and amnesia while being described as medical care for trauma-related psychological disorders. The drugs were administered by Dr. Howard Baldwin, who had been retained despite his lack of legitimate medical credentials because of his willingness to participate in the cover-up and his expertise in using chemical substances to control human behavior. The reformatory's financial records were subjected to a comprehensive audit that found minor irregularities, but no evidence of systematic fraud or criminal activity. The auditors, who had been carefully selected for their discretion and their willingness to accept the reformatory's explanation of questionable transactions, attributed any discrepancies to administrative oversights that were common in large institutions and recommended improved bookkeeping procedures to prevent future problems. The audit report made no mention of the massive payments that had been made to maintain the institution's network of complicit officials, describing these expenditures as consulting fees and equipment purchases that were legitimate business expenses. The auditors praised the reformatory's financial management and recommended that other institutions adopt similar practices to achieve fiscal efficiency while maintaining high standards of care. The Detroit newspapers, which had once celebrated the reformatory's achievements with regular features and editorials, participated in the cover-up through calculated silence that demonstrated their owners' commitment to protecting the city's business interests. Articles about the institution's reforms appeared regularly, describing improvements in facilities and programs without mentioning the investigation that had prompted these changes. Reporters who attempted to investigate the story found themselves reassigned to other beats or dismissed from their positions entirely, often with explanations that their work had become unreliable or that budget constraints required staff reductions. The few journalists who persisted in their efforts to expose the truth discovered that their sources would no longer speak with them, and that city officials refused to provide information or access to public records. The reformatory's powerful supporters used their influence to reshape the narrative about the institution's history and eliminate any suggestion that serious problems had ever existed. Philanthropist Henry Wallace, who had been a major financial contributor since the reformatory's founding, established a scholarship fund in Margaret Wells's name, praising her pioneering work in juvenile rehabilitation and her contributions to progressive approaches to child welfare. The fund's announcement, published in all major Detroit newspapers, portrayed Wells as a visionary educator who had been forced to relocate due to political pressures from opponents of progressive reform, who were uncomfortable with her innovative methods. The scholarship fund provided financial assistance to young people pursuing careers in social work and education, creating a lasting memorial to Wells that reinforced the fiction of her benevolent character. The federal government, which had been considering the Coldwater model for national adoption and had commissioned studies of the reformatory's methods, quietly abandoned its plans without explanation. The National Commission on Child Welfare, which had featured Wells as a keynote speaker at its annual conferences, removed all references to the reformatory from its publications and proceedings, claiming that the institution had become less relevant to current policy discussions. The Commission's official history, published years later, made no mention of the institution or its methods, despite the fact that the reformatory had been considered one of the most important innovations in juvenile justice reform. Federal officials, who had previously praised the reformatory's achievements, suddenly found other priorities for their attention, and the institutional reform movement lost its most prominent example of successful innovation. The reformatory continued to operate under its new management, but on a much smaller scale that reflected its reduced function as a profitable enterprise rather than a center for systematic abuse. The number of children housed there dropped from over 400 to fewer than 100. With the facility serving primarily as a holding center for children who were being processed for transfer to other institutions or for adoption by families who were willing to accept damaged children without asking questions about their backgrounds. The institution's various enterprises, the laundry service, carpentry shop, and textile workshop, were discontinued, ostensibly due to changes in the local economy that made these operations unprofitable. In reality, the enterprises had been shut down because they provided too many opportunities for outside observers to witness evidence of abuse, and because the reduced number of children made large-scale manufacturing operations impractical. The facility's medical program was transferred to Detroit's Municipal Hospital, effectively ending the institution's capacity for the experimental treatments that had characterized the Wells era. The transfer was described as an efficiency measure that would provide children with better access to qualified medical care while reducing the reformatory's operating costs, but it actually eliminated the infrastructure that had been used for systematic torture and murder. The children who had survived the reformatory's abuse carried their trauma into adulthood, but their voices were systematically suppressed through a combination of legal harassment, economic pressure, and psychological manipulation. Those who attempted to speak publicly about their experiences found themselves subjected to lawsuits for defamation, loss of employment based on character concerns, and threats against their families that convinced them that silence was their only option for survival. The few survivors who persisted in their efforts to expose the truth were often committed to mental institutions based on claims that their stories were evidence of psychological instability, or they were charged with crimes that resulted in their imprisonment and removal from public view. The legal system that should have protected these victims instead became another tool for suppressing their testimony and maintaining the conspiracy of silence that protected the reformatory's operators. The reformatory's records, which had documented the systematic abuse of hundreds of children over nearly 2 decades, were officially declared destroyed by fire in 1908. The fire, which occurred in a storage facility that housed the institution's archives, was attributed to faulty electrical wiring and was investigated only perfunctorily by fire department officials who found no evidence of arson despite the suspicious timing and the convenient destruction of incriminating evidence. No effort was made to salvage any of the documentation that had been lost, and insurance claims for the destroyed records were paid without question by companies that had financial relationships with the reformatory's board members. The destruction of the archives eliminated the most comprehensive evidence of the institution's crimes and ensured that future investigators would find only scattered fragments of information that could be easily dismissed or explained away. The physical evidence of the reformatory's crimes was systematically eliminated through a coordinated effort that involved construction crews, landscaping teams, and waste disposal companies that were paid generously for their discretion. The basement areas where the most serious abuse had occurred were filled with concrete and converted to storage space for legitimate institutional supplies, eliminating any trace of the torture chambers that had claimed so many young lives. The medical equipment that had been used for torture was removed and destroyed, with some pieces being sold as scrap metal and others being disposed of in industrial furnaces that left no trace of their existence. The institution's grounds were landscaped extensively to eliminate any evidence of the burial sites where victims had been interred, with new gardens and walkways covering areas where bodies had been hastily buried during the height of the abuse. The reformatory's location along the Detroit River provided a convenient means of disposing of additional evidence that might have connected the institution to its crimes. Local fishermen reported that the recovery of children's personal items from the riverbank ceased abruptly after 1905, suggesting that the institution had found more effective methods of eliminating traces of its victims, or that the volume of evidence requiring disposal had decreased significantly. The river itself became complicit in the cover-up, its currents carrying away the last physical remnants of the reformatory's crimes, and ensuring that future generations would find no trace of the horrors that had occurred along its banks. The waters that had once been stained with children's blood returned to their natural state, giving no indication of the suffering they had witnessed or the secrets they had helped to hide. The Coldwater Children's Reformatory finally closed its doors in 1923, ostensibly due to changing approaches to juvenile rehabilitation that made the institution's methods obsolete. The closing was actually the result of declining profits caused by increased oversight of child welfare institutions, and the difficulty of maintaining profitable operations without the systematic abuse that had characterized the facility's peak years. The building was sold to a private developer, who converted it into luxury apartments, with no mention of the structure's dark history in the marketing materials or sales documents. The conversion was completed quickly and efficiently, with construction crews instructed to avoid any excavation that might uncover evidence of the institution's crimes. The luxury apartments were marketed to wealthy professionals who were attracted by the building's Gothic architecture and riverfront location. The reformatory's closing was reported in the Detroit newspapers as the end of an era, with articles praising the institution's 18 years of dedicated service to the city's most vulnerable children. and expressing nostalgia for a time when charitable organizations could operate without excessive government interference. The articles made no mention of the investigation that had revealed the reformatory's true nature, instead focusing on the positive contributions the institution had supposedly made to Detroit's social development. The site where the reformatory once stood bears no marker or memorial to commemorate the children who suffered and died there, and efforts by historians and victims' advocates to establish such recognition have been consistently blocked by property owners and city officials who prefer to let the past remain buried. The luxury apartments that replaced the institution are occupied by residents who have no knowledge of the horrors that once occurred within those limestone walls, and most remain unaware that their homes were built on what amounts to a mass grave for forgotten children. The Detroit River continues to flow past the former reformatory grounds, carrying with it the secrets of those who chose silence over justice and profit over humanity. The waters that once carried away evidence of systematic child abuse now reflect the lights of modern Detroit, giving no indication of the darkness that lies beneath the surface of the city's carefully constructed historical narrative. Today, the Coldwater Children's Reformatory exists only in scattered archival records that hint at its true nature without revealing the full extent of its crimes. The institution's victims, those who survived and those who did not, have been effectively erased from history through a conspiracy of silence that has proven more durable than the building that housed their suffering. Their stories remain untold, their suffering unacknowledged, their deaths uninvestigated. The reformatory's legacy is one of institutional power successfully deployed to protect itself and its supporters, while ensuring that the truth about systematic child abuse would remain buried beneath layers of official denial, bureaucratic obfuscation, and calculated silence. The cover-up that began in 1905 has proven so effective that even today, more than a century later, the full extent of the reformatory's crimes remains unknown and the identities of its victims to be lost to history. The dark waters of the Detroit River have long since washed away the physical evidence of the Coldwater Children's Reformatory's crimes, but they cannot cleanse the moral stain that remains on a city and a society that chose to protect the powerful rather than defend the innocent. The institution's story serves as a reminder of how easily society's most vulnerable members can be sacrificed to protect the reputation and interests of those in power, and how effectively the machinery of cover-up can operate when the stakes are high enough and the perpetrators possess sufficient influence to rewrite history itself. The reformatory's victims deserved justice, protection, and remembrance, but they received only suffering, abandonment, and erasure. Their voices were silenced, not just by their tormentors, but by an entire system that found it more convenient to forget their existence than to acknowledge the failures that had enabled their abuse. The conspiracy of silence that protected the Coldwater Children's Reformatory continues to this day, ensuring that the lessons that should have been learned from this tragedy remain unheeded, and that similar horrors could emerge again under the cover of charitable work and progressive reform. If this story impacted you, if you stayed until the end, it's because you feel these hidden truths also need to be exposed. So leave in the comments the city you're watching from. This way we can see how far these stories are reaching, and subscribe to the channel. There are many other cases the world tried to forget, but we insist on remembering.